The world revered him as the Godfather, the untouchable patriarch who could solve any problem with a mere gesture of his hand. On the silver screen, he was the embodiment of control, a man who shielded his family from danger with ruthless grace. But on the night of May 16, 1990, the script that fate wrote for Marlon Brando contained no such power, and certainly no Hollywood ending. High atop the fog-laden curves of Mulholland Drive, the silence of the Los Angeles hills was shattered by the deafening crack of a .45 caliber handgun. In that single, irrevocable moment, the most famous actor in the world was reduced to a trembling spectator in his own living room. He was not the impeccably dressed Don. He was a disheveled, aging father clad only in a robe, his hands stained not with the metaphorical blood of cinema, but with the warm, sticky reality of a tragedy he was powerless to prevent. The man standing over the body with a smoking gun was not an enemy, but his own son, Christian. It is said that every parent's worst nightmare begins with a phone call in the dead of night. But for Brando, the nightmare was birthed right there on his Persian rug. The voice that spoke to the 911 operator was unrecognizable to the millions who had hung on his every whisper in theaters for decades. It was the broken, gasping voice of a man drowning in shock. "My son, I think he shot someone," he stammered, the words heavy with a disbelief that seemed to suspend time itself. When the police units ascended the winding driveway to the estate, a fortress built to keep the prying eyes of the world at bay, they expected a scene from a movie. Instead, they found a tableau of Greek tragedy. There lay the lifeless body of 26-year-old Dag Drollet, the lover of Brando's daughter and the father of his unborn grandchild. Hovering over him, weeping, was Marlon Brando himself, frantically attempting mouth-to-mouth resuscitation, trying to breathe life back into a body that had already departed. The atmosphere inside the mansion was thick, with a tension that felt almost physical, a suffocating mixture of gunpowder smoke and the metallic scent of fresh blood. A television was still flickering in the corner, casting an eerie, dancing blue light over the carnage. It was a grotesque contrast, the banality of a quiet evening at home colliding violently with an act of supreme brutality. The most chilling element of the scene was the presence of the shooter. Christian Brando, 32 years old, sat nearby, lost in a haze of alcohol and confusion. He looked like a lost child who had broken a vase, only this vase was a human life. He did not run. He simply sat there absorbing the enormity of what he had done, while his father was paralyzed by the sheer crushing weight of parental failure. To understand the gravity of this night, one must look beyond the yellow police tape. That would soon cordon off the estate. This was not merely a celebrity scandal. It was the implosion of a dynasty. For years, the Brando household had been a pressure cooker of dysfunction, sealed tight by wealth and privacy. The gun that Christian held was not just a weapon. It was the final punctuation mark in a sentence written over decades of neglect, custody battles, and the poisonous side effects of extreme fame. The victim, Dag Drollet, was the scion of a prominent Tahitian family who had come to Los Angeles with dreams of raising a family with Brando's daughter, Cheyenne. Cheyenne, the fragile and deeply troubled princess of this dark kingdom, was carrying Drollet's child. She had whispered something to her brother earlier that evening during dinner, a complaint or an accusation of abuse. Words that may have been true or the hallucinations of a fracturing mind. Regardless of the truth, those whispers ignited a fuse in Christian that had been burning since his own chaotic childhood. As the sirens wailed in the distance, drawing closer like banshees announcing the fall of a king, Marlon Brando must have looked at his son and seen the ghost of his own past. He had spent a lifetime running from the shadow of his own abusive father, swearing he would be different, swearing he would protect his children from the hardness of the world. Yet here he was, staring at his firstborn, who now held the title of a killer. The irony was cruel and absolute. The man who had played the protector so perfectly on screen had failed to protect anyone in reality. He could not protect Dag from Christian, He could not protect Christian from his own demons, and he could not protect Cheyenne from the devastation that was about to consume her. As the police officers entered the room, guns drawn, shouting commands that bounced uselessly off the walls, the world as Brando knew it ended. The bullet that struck Dag Drollet did not just end a life, it shattered the myth of Marlon Brando. It exposed the rot beneath the gilding, the sorrow beneath the success. As Christian was led away in handcuffs, stumbling and dazed, leaving his father alone with a corpse and a legacy in ruins, the question hanging in the air was not, how did this happen? But rather, why did it take this long? The tragedy of Mulholland Drive was not an accident. It was an inevitability, a dark destiny fulfilling itself. Before the gavels banged and the headlines screamed, there was just that moment of absolute terrifying clarity. A father, a son, a gun, and a silence so loud it deafened the soul. This is the story of that silence and the screaming that followed. To comprehend why a 32-year-old man would execute his sister's lover in his father's home, one cannot simply look at the events of a single evening. The gun may have gone off in 1990, but the chamber was loaded decades earlier, in the nursery of a home that was less a sanctuary than a battlefield. Christian Brando was born in 1958 as the Crown Prince of Hollywood, the firstborn son of the world's most famous actor. However, from his very first breath, he was not treated as a child to be nurtured, but as a weapon to be wielded in a vicious war between two people who despised each other. His mother, Anna Kashfi, and his father, Marlon Brando, were locked in a custody battle that made the front pages of tabloids look tame. It was a War of the Roses played out with real casualties. And the primary casualty was a confused little boy caught in the crossfire. By the time he was a toddler, Christian had already lived a lifetime of instability. The most harrowing chapter of this saga occurred when he was just a boy, snatched away by his mother in a desperate bid for control. She hid him in a remote hippie commune in Baja, California, while Marlon unleashed a team of private investigators to scour the desert for his lost son. When they finally found him, Christian was sick, terrified, and suffering from severe bronchitis, trembling in a tent miles away from the luxury he was born into. This was his childhood, a pendulum swinging violently between kidnapping attempts, courtroom screaming matches, and long stretches of crushing loneliness. His mother told him his father was a devil. His father told him his mother was insane. With no solid ground to stand on, Christian grew up without a moral compass, learning early on that love was transactional and that violence, emotional or physical, was the primary language of family. As he grew older, the shadow of his father became a suffocating weight. To be the son of Marlon Brando was to be constantly measured against a god and found wanting. Christian dropped out of high school, drifted through life, and sought solace in the same demons that haunted his family tree: alcohol and drugs. He was a young man with a famous last name, but no identity of his own, floating in a haze of substance abuse, desperate for approval that never came. He was the troubled son, a cliché of Hollywood tragedy, armed with a trust fund but bankrupt of purpose. While Marlon retreated further into his own eccentric isolation on his private island in Tahiti, Christian remained in Los Angeles, a ticking time bomb waiting for a spark. That spark arrived in the form of his half-sister Cheyenne. If Christian was the lost prince, Cheyenne was the doomed princess. The daughter of Brando's Tahitian wife, Tarita, she was the apple of her father's eye, the exotic beauty he tried to keep hidden from the corrupting influence of the West. But the Brando curse found her too. A horrific car accident had scarred her face and shattered her modeling career, plunging her into a deep depression that spiraled into schizophrenia. By 1990, she was pregnant, unstable, and deeply dependent on her brother. She arrived in Los Angeles with her boyfriend, Dag Drollet, the scion of a prominent Tahitian family. Dag was everything Christian was not: educated, composed, and seemingly perfect. He was the good son figure that Marlon respected, which only deepened the well of resentment brewing in Christian's gut. The tension in the Mulholland Drive estate during the days leading up to the shooting was palpable. The air was thick with unsaid things and ancient grievances. Christian, already battling his own addictions, became fiercely protective of Cheyenne. In his warped reality, he saw himself as her only defender, the knight who would finally prove his worth. During that fateful dinner on May 16th, the atmosphere was suffocating. Cheyenne, struggling with her mental health and perhaps hallucinating, leaned over to her brother and whispered the poison that would kill Dag Drollet. She claimed that Dag was beating her. She claimed he was abusive. Whether these were the delusions of a sick mind or a manipulation born of misery, Christian did not question them. He didn't ask for proof. He didn't confront Dag with words. For Christian, this was the moment of validation he had waited 32 years for. It was a chance to be the hero, to be the strong man his father always played in the movies. Fueled by heavy drinking and a lifetime of suppressed rage, he didn't see Dag Drollet sitting on the couch. He saw every failure, every rejection, and every enemy he had ever imagined. He went to his father's gun collection, a stash of weapons that were meant to protect the home, and chose a .45 caliber handgun. As he walked back into the living room, the weight of the gun in his hand felt like power. He was no longer the disappointment. He was the judge, jury, and executioner. He approached Dag, who was relaxing, watching television, completely unaware that the family drama he had married into was about to reach its violent crescendo. The tragedy was not just that a gun was fired, it was that the bullet was propelled by 30 years of pain, fired by a boy who never really grew up, aimed at a man whose only crime was loving a woman who could not be saved. The dawn that broke over Los Angeles following the shooting did not bring clarity. It brought a circus. The privacy that Marlon Brando had spent a lifetime fiercely guarding was obliterated in an instant. The Santa Monica courthouse became the epicenter of a global media frenzy that rivaled the coverage of heads of state. Satellite trucks lined the streets, paparazzi climbed trees for a glimpse of the fallen idol, and the world waited to see if the son of the Godfather would face the death penalty. Christian Brando was charged with first-degree murder. The prosecutor was not interested in the narrative of a tragic accident. He saw a cold-blooded execution carried out by a spoiled, intoxicated heir who believed he was above the law. The stakes could not have been higher. If convicted, Christian wasn't just facing prison, he was facing the potential of life behind bars, or worse. For Marlon, this was no longer about reputation. It was a primal battle for the survival of his bloodline. Marlon threw the full weight of his legendary status and his diminishing fortune into the defense. He hired the most expensive legal gladiators money could buy, turning the courtroom into a stage where he would give the most painful performance of his life. But this was a performance stripped of vanity. When the day came for him to take the stand, the man who walked into the courtroom was a ghost of his former self. He was bloated, his eyes hidden behind dark sunglasses that he eventually removed to reveal a gaze filled with infinite sorrow. He did not try to intimidate, he tried to humanize. Under oath, with the world watching, Marlon Brando dismantled his own myth. He wept openly, his shoulders shaking with sobs that seemed to emanate from the very depths of his soul. "I tried to be a good father," he choked out, a confession that shattered the silence of the room. "I did the best I could." He took the blame upon himself, painting a picture of a family destroyed by his own fame and the toxic war with his ex-wife. It was a strategy of humiliation. To save his son, he had to destroy himself. However, the prosecution had a different story to tell, one written in blood spatter and ballistics reports. They argued that the struggle Christian described was a fabrication. The forensic evidence suggested that Dag Drollet was shot while sitting in a relaxed position, possibly leaning back watching television. The angle of the bullet entering the neck and traveling downwards contradicted the story of a wrestling match over the gun. Furthermore, the weapon itself, a Sig Sauer .45, was not a hair-trigger pistol that went off with a whisper. It required significant pressure to fire. The physical evidence screamed murder, not accident. But the prosecution had a gaping hole in their case. the absence of the only other witness. Cheyenne Brando had been spirited away to Tahiti immediately after the shooting by her father. The official reason was her crumbling mental health, but the strategic advantage was undeniable. Without her testimony, without her confirming that she had incited Christian or that she heard the argument, the timeline was blurry. The prosecutors fought to have her extradited, but French law protected her, and her psychiatric state made her legally incompetent to testify. She was the ghost in the machine, her silence as loud as the gunshot. As the trial dragged on, it became a macabre stalemate. The defense knew the physical evidence was damning. The prosecution knew that without Cheyenne and with the jury's sympathy for a weeping Marlon, a first-degree murder conviction was risky. The possibility of a hung jury loomed large. Behind closed doors, a deal was brokered. It was a compromise that satisfied no one but served the cold logic of the legal system. Christian Brando agreed to plead guilty to voluntary manslaughter. The charge of murder was dropped. The narrative was legally rewritten. It was no longer an execution, but a killing done in the heat of passion. The sentencing hearing was the final act of this judicial tragedy. The judge, unmoved by the celebrity in the room, handed down a sentence of 10 years in state prison. It was a decade of life for a life taken. When the gavel banged, there was no applause, no sense of triumph. Marlon sat stone-faced, absorbing the reality that his son would spend his 30s in a cage. Christian, handcuffed and looking smaller than ever, was led away, trading the luxury of Mulholland Drive for the brutal reality of the California penal system. The legal battle was over, but the moral reckoning had just begun. The Brando family had survived the court of law, but they had been irrevocably broken in the court of public opinion. The Godfather had saved his son from death, but he could not save him from the consequences of his sins, nor could he save himself from the haunting truth that his legacy was now written in blood. The cameras packed up, the satellite trucks drove away, but the ghost of Dag Drollet remained, a permanent resident of the mansion on the hill. With Christian behind bars, the curtain did not fall on the Brando tragedy. It merely rose on the second and perhaps most heartbreaking act of the nightmare. The spotlight shifted from the cold steel of the California prison system to the humid, suffocating isolation of Tahiti, where Cheyenne Brando was slowly unraveling. If Christian was the instrument of destruction, Cheyenne was its collateral damage, a soul too fragile for the heavy machinery of her family's drama. Following the shooting, her mental state fractured completely. She was diagnosed with schizophrenia and drifted in and out of psychiatric hospitals, haunted by the ghost of the lover she had inadvertently condemned to death. She became a prisoner in her own mind, trapped between grief for Dag Drollet and a confusing, toxic mixture of love and hatred for her father and brother. In a moment of lucid devastation during an interview, she uttered the sentence that would stain her father's obituary forever. "My father is a murderer. He killed Dag just as surely as if he pulled the trigger himself." Marlon, in a misguided attempt to protect her, kept her secluded in Tahiti, far from the prying eyes of the American press, but also far from the specialized care she desperately needed. The isolation did not heal her. It festered. On Easter Sunday, April 16, 1995, 5 years after the shooting, the silence of the Brando estate was broken once again, this time by a mother's scream. Cheyenne Brando, at the age of 25, hanged herself in her bedroom. She left behind a young son, Tuki, and a note that remained private. But her message to the world was clear. The weight of being a Brando was simply too heavy to bear. When the news reached Marlon in Los Angeles, the man who had weathered decades of Hollywood storms finally broke. He was hospitalized, physically and spiritually collapsed. He did not attend his daughter's funeral in Tahiti, a decision that critics called callous, but friends described as the paralysis of a man who could not face the 2 fresh graves he felt responsible for digging. Christian Brando was released from prison in 1996, having served 5 years of his sentence. He walked out of the prison gates not as a reformed man, but as a hardened, bitter survivor of a wreckage he helped create. The handsome, troubled youth was gone, replaced by a bloat of anger and resentment. He tried to disappear into anonymity, living a reclusive life in Washington state, working manual labor jobs and trying to outrun his last name. But the demons were patient. He remained entangled in legal troubles and abusive relationships, never escaping the orbit of violence that defined his adult life. He and his father remained estranged, communicating through lawyers and silence. The great irony of their relationship was that while Marlon had spent millions to save Christian's life, he had no idea how to be in it. Christian died in 2008 of pneumonia, alone and destitute at the age of 49. He had survived the prison system, but he had not survived his childhood. Marlon Brando spent his final years as a king in exile, barricaded inside the Mulholland Drive mansion that had become a mausoleum of bad memories. The greatest actor of the 20th century, the man who changed the art of performance forever, withered away in a self-imposed prison of food and silence. He ballooned to over 300 pounds, his physical decay mirroring the ruin of his family life. Visitors described a house that was dark and quiet, where the legendary actor would sit for hours, hooked up to an oxygen tank, watching old movies or staring into nothingness. He died on July 1st, 2004, of pulmonary fibrosis. The obituaries praised his genius, listing his Oscars and his masterpieces. But the subtext of every tribute was the unavoidable tragedy of his bloodline. He left behind a complicated will, a scattered brood of children, and a legend that was as cautionary as it was celebratory. Today, the mansion on Mulholland Drive is gone, demolished to make way for something new, as if erasing the physical structure could erase the history etched into the soil. But the story remains. It is the ultimate American tragedy, a dark inversion of the dream where unlimited success, money, and fame could not purchase the one thing that mattered: a happy family. Marlon Brando could play any role, embody any emotion, and convince the world of any truth except one. He could never play the role of a father who saved his children. The legacy of that night in 1990 is not just a cautionary tale about gun safety or the justice system. It is a testament to the fact that you can conquer the world and still lose your soul within the four walls of your own home. The gun is silent now. The actors are dead, but the echo of that gunshot still rings out, a permanent reminder that even the gods of Hollywood bleed, and when they fall, they crush everything beneath them.